Add my welcome to Johnny's and wish you a very happy Christmas. Thank you for joining us for our traditional carol service. I don't know how you're feeling today and whether today's been a sort of frantic reorganisation after the Prime Minister's announcement yesterday about Tier 4. I'm certainly sad I won't be able to see my mum and my sister and my nephew as I expected. And I guess the same sadness for many of us who are part of this service. It just makes this reading, I think, even more appropriate than when I first chose it. And there'll be no more gloom, it says, for those who are in anguish. Maybe anguish is a bit strong to describe our experience, but there are people in anguish at the moment. And here is a promise of light for those who are in darkness. This morning we had a service and I had no Christmas decorations at all and was rebuked by some of those who are there. So I've got a few now. I've got my Christmas tree with its battery going a bit flat and a few lights there. But Christmas lights haven't been quite the same, have they, this year? I don't know if you got to see any in Oxford Street, or my favourite ones are in Carnaby Street, which has a whole load of slogans hanging and made of neon with optimistic words. Don't know what you make of that. Things like future, hope, together, wish. All of these words that we would love 2021 to be different to how 2020 has been. But you might say, well, it's obvious how this has come true. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. It's obvious what that is. As the star travelled in the sky and the astrologers from the east followed it, and it came to rest over a small laboratory. And inside they'd found a vaccine. I mean, surely that's the light, isn't it? That is the hope for the new year. We put our trust in the biologists, and the biologists have come to our rescue. And I guess that's what a lot of people are thinking. Maybe you're thinking that. And it makes you wonder why the Christians are still clinging on to this message about Jesus, who seems to be a complete irrelevance to the whole situation. I mean, in past years, past ages, when there was a pandemic, so something like the Black Death or Spanish flu, people cried out to God, Lord, please have mercy on us. Please save our country from this pestilence. But it's my experience that in the UK, we haven't really done that in large numbers. Maybe around the world, people haven't really done that. Instead, we've looked to the doctors to help us, to save us, the NHS and the biochemists and the vaccine developers. And we hoped that they would save us, and they have. So why the concern about Jesus? What does he really have to offer? Around Greenwich at the moment, they're doing there's a display of Advent lights, Advent windows. It's like a kind of Advent calendar, but there's a map and you can have a look around, and each house has some sort of art installation, one for each day of December. And just around the corner from me on Park Vista, the installation for the 6th of December, you can still see it if you want to. It's on 14C Park Vista, just by Greenwich Park. Their installation is called Light at the End of the Tunnel, and it's quite clever. It's in their front garden. There's a long tube filled with fairy lights if you look down the middle of it. And then right at the end, a hypodermic syringe. Surely that is the hope. That is the light that's dawned for our country. Well, I'm not denying that that is very good news, and I certainly don't want to give us a false either or, as if we have to choose between the biology and the saviour Jesus. I mean, I will be taking the vaccine when it becomes available to me, and I'll be encouraging my parents to take it, and I think it's great news. But actually, we do need the saviour that Isaiah speaks of, because the Pfizer vaccine is not sufficient to save us from the darkness that we're in. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. When Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, writing 700 years before the birth of Jesus, when he first wrote those words, he was talking about the darkness of war, conflict, people who were to be enslaved by another nation. Now, I was thinking, what is worse than dying from a virus that makes it impossible for you to breathe? I mean, that's a pretty horrible way to go. But I thought, well, one thing worse than that is dying because somebody else actually wanted to kill you. A situation of war and conflict. And there's still war and conflict around the world today. as there was in Isaiah's day. For example, I think we've barely noticed news of the tensions in Ethiopia, the near civil war there, the reports of genocide as a whole village, all the women and children killed. We barely noticed that. The conflict in our own streets. One of my friends phoned me yesterday afternoon quite distressed because she'd been out in central London, and at the bus stop there was just her and a couple, and then to her horror the man in the couple lashed out and hit his wife violently across the face. My friend was totally shocked, and she said to the woman, "Are you okay?" And she goes, "Oh no, I'm fine." And my friend sort of withdrew around the corner and called the police, and the police came. It turned out that this man already had a restraining order against this woman, but had broken it, and so he was arrested, and they spent the afternoon watching CCTV. They tell us, don't they, that domestic violence has gone up to frightening levels during the lockdown. There is violence around the world. There is war, and yet even in Isaiah's day, the war wasn't the problem. The war was a sign of the problem. It was a sign of a deeper spiritual darkness in that nation and in our world. The way in which we become alienated from the God who made us. And as a result, we become alienated from each other. And we also become in conflict with our world itself. And things like pandemics and domestic violence and international conflict, and you might add things like extinctions and global warming, and all of the things in this world that are crying out to us are actually a sign of something deeper being wrong. There is a great darkness. And I hope that you're not so sort of short-sighted as thinking that if we can solve COVID, everything will be okay. I mean, of course, solving COVID will be a great help. That would be a great thing. And I'm all for vaccines and an end to lockdowns and so on. But there's more wrong than that. There were viruses before COVID. There'll be viruses after it. There'll be diseases. There'll be death. There'll be conflict. There'll be tensions in families. There'll be a deep sense of distance between us and the God that we were made to love. And Isaiah says for that you need more than a vaccine. But there's really, really good news. He said, the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in the land of deep darkness, on them has light shined. You've multiplied the nation, you've increased its joy. They rejoice before you with joy at the harvest, as they're glad when they divide the spoil. For the yoke of his burden, the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, they were to be slaves, these people, will be broken as on the day of Midian. That's a hard reference for us to understand unless you know the Bible really well, but the reference to Midian describes a battle earlier in the Bible when Gideon fought against an army of oppressors, the Midianites, with a very unusual military strategy. There was a tiny army and they were armed with nothing but jars and trumpets. And at the beginning of the battle, they smashed the jars and blew the trumpets and they won. Now, this is not advice for how to win a war. It's a very unusual strategy, almost certainly doomed to failure. It's a ridiculous way to fight. But the point is that they didn't really fight at all because God supernaturally intervened in that battle and brought about peace for them as they were just bystanders with a minor part to play. And that is the point that Isaiah is making here. When there is an end to this darkness, when there is peace in the face of this war, it won't be us that brought it about. It will be the result of a miraculous intervention of God himself. And what a peace there will be, says Isaiah. Every boot of the tramping warrior in battle tumult, every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. That will be quite a bonfire, won't it? I was looking up the statistics, and with the anniversary of the First World War recently, we got some of them in the newspapers. Apparently there were 46,973,000 boots issued by the British Army in World War One, and 31,764,000 jackets. Imagine all of those in a huge pyramid, and then you set fire to it. And that's just one army's battle for one particular war. It's quite a bonfire, as all of the battle clothes around the world are not needed anymore. There's not going to be any more wars or conflicts, because there's been a solution to the human predicament at the deepest level. We are reconciled. Now, how is that going to come about? How will that happen? Isaiah says, because of the birth of a baby. Now, we've got a musical item a bit later on, which I'll introduce, but I really wanted us to sing from the Messiah, Handel's Messiah, for unto us a child is born. Maybe you know the tune, and unfortunately we couldn't get together in lockdown, the entire string orchestra and massed choirs that this would require, but maybe you know the music, and you'll be humming along in your head as I read these words. For unto us a child is born, for unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful. And then the strings go mad on the violins. Counselor, more violins. Mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Isaiah says there's great news. The lights are going to be switched on to a dark world because of a baby being born. Now, I'm an uncle for the first time this year, and I'm very grateful that I got to see my nephew earlier on before this recent tier 4 lockdown. But there are often great hopes, aren't there, about children and aspirations of their parents about who they're going to grow up to be. So Eli's a very handsome young man. He looks like his uncle, at least I think he does. And already there's enormous excitement. So he has got a very advanced musical toy. He presses a button and it plays all sorts of great music. And maybe he's going to be a great musician, we think. You know, maybe this will be foundational to his musical training. Or he manages to climb up one step of the stairs and maybe he's going to be a great athlete or a sportsman of some kind. You know, it's not unusual for people to have great aspirations for children, but these aspirations, they're just through the roof, aren't they? His name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And if you're tuning into this service and you're not sure what you make of Christianity or of Jesus Christ, then I'm not asking you to accept it just on the basis of the hype. This was a prediction made 700 years before Jesus' birth by a prophet speaking to people who are having a gloomy time. And he said it's going to get great, it's going to be great, it's going to get better. But I would invite you to fast forward 700 years to the birth of this baby and to see whether he matches up to the expectations. Read the nativity story and think, does it match what Isaiah hoped and promised? One of the things actually that strikes you as you read the nativity accounts immediately is how Jesus' birth happens in fulfillment of very specific promises that were made beforehand. It was predicted he would be born of a virgin later in or earlier in Isaiah's prophecy. It was predicted that he'd be born in Bethlehem in a prophecy by Micah. Jesus, as you might know, conducted much of his ministry in Galilee, which was an unknown backwater up in the north of the country. But here in our reading, it was predicted that it would be Galilee that would be the first to see the light dawning. In lots of ways, Jesus' life looks like it was scripted in advance. It matches the predictions. But rather than just reading the Christmas story, my invitation to you today is that you read on. We had the readings that you probably know already, Mary and Joseph, the angels, the shepherds. I'd read those loads of times, but never until I went to university did I read on. Those readings actually come just from chapter 2 of a biography of Jesus that's 24 chapters long. And I'd encourage you to see what happens in chapter 3 and chapter 4 and chapter 5 and what happens to this baby when he grows up, and does he match this description? Wonderful Counselor. It speaks of great wisdom, great counsel that he would give. Actually, some of us in Grace Church Greenwich have been reading this book, which I strongly recommend to you, Tom Holland's Dominion. And Tom Holland isn't a Christian, he's a secular historian, but he writes in this book about the enormous difference that the teaching of Jesus Christ has made to Western culture, how it's utterly transformed our thinking. And things that we take for granted actually were quite unknown before Jesus' arrival on the planet. So, for example, and a friend pointed this out to me, as we're planning to roll out the coronavirus vaccine, as we've started to already, there's a strict hierarchy of who gets it first. It begins with people who work for the NHS, and then people who have complicated medical conditions like diabetes, or they're immunosuppressed in some way. And then after that, the oldest people, and then gradually younger and younger people. We deal with the most vulnerable first. And that's absolutely right that we do that, but it is a distinctively Christian thing to do, to care about the weak and to care about the vulnerable. And it's so instinctive to us that we probably don't even realize that it comes from the teaching of Jesus Christ. And thus our society has taken it for granted. Just to show you how it isn't an automatic belief, let me contrast it with the view of Charles Darwin. And I'm reading this from a book of essays by the literary critic Marilyn Robinson, who first drew my attention to it. But I think you'll find it quite chilling and quite shocking. So Darwin is writing about the survival of the fittest, the idea that natural selection is our creator. And he's got something very shocking to say about vaccination. With savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated. Those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. There is reason to believe that vaccination has preserved thousands who, from a weak constitution, would formerly have succumbed to smallpox. I guess is the equivalent of COVID in his day. Thus, the weak members of civilized society propagate their kind. No one who's attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. It's surprising how soon a want of care, or care wrongly directed, leads to the degeneration of a domestic race. But excepting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. Now that is, I think, very chilling. And to spell it out for you, what he's saying is pandemics like smallpox are a really good thing because they weed out the weak ones. So it'd be great, wouldn't it, if all the asthmatics died and all the people with immunosuppressed illnesses, they died. That would get them out of the gene pool and the human race would evolve better. Survival after all of the fittest. And I read it so that, I mean, that is alarming, but actually it's a very logical position if we're here purely by chance. And human DNA is just the outcome of this kind of process of selection over and over again. And there's no God and there's no creator and life has no intrinsic value. And how different it is from the values of Western Britain as we look to care for the weak and the vulnerable. Well, that's good. But that all comes from the teaching of this man, the wonderful counselor. What about the next claim, that he is mighty God? I mean, just how powerful was Jesus when he faced evil or disease or death? You read on in the biographies and you'll discover extraordinary miracles that Jesus does before eyewitnesses. And not because they were credulous fools who didn't understand about science. No, these were ordinary people who knew the hardships of life and who were astonished at the things that they saw Jesus do as he healed the sick and opened the eyes of the blind and even raised the dead. Wonderful counselor, mighty God, everlasting Father. I mean, the Father bit we get, someone who looks after you and cares for you, but the everlasting bit. Is it true that Jesus is one who lives forever? What about the claims of his resurrection from the dead? That he would be somebody who was always there for us and would never let us down. And then the last claim, that he would be the Prince of Peace. What kind of efforts did Jesus go to bring and establish peace? And that takes us right to the heart of his message as he hangs on a cross to pay the price of reconciliation between humanity and the God that we've rejected, and to bring reconciliation between human beings and other human beings. Don't just believe the hype, these great promises, but please would you read for yourself to see how they come true. His name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And we need that as a human race. Please don't think that the pandemic is the last problem that we will face in our lifetime. And if we get that fixed, everything will be okay. There are problems before it, there'll be problems after it. One of my friends in November sent me an email saying, Andy, could you give me a ring? I've got something important I need to tell you. And I thought, gosh, your imagination starts to run wild. What will it be? So I gave him a call. He's about my age, just a bit older than me. And he said, oh, Andrew, I wanted to tell you firsthand that I've got some bad news. I went to the doctor and it turns out that the headaches I've been getting are signs of a brain tumor. And I've got less than a year to live. I was totally shocked. But there will be cancers and other diseases and deaths after COVID. There will be domestic violence and wars and conflicts and broken families after COVID. And at its heart is a problem between us and the God that made us, what Isaiah calls a deep darkness. And what great news it is that a baby was born who came to be a saviour. We still need him. And I'd love you to check it out, to read yourself one of the eyewitness biographies. We can post you one if you're on this Facebook channel or this Zoom channel, you don't have a copy of the Bible. Just give us your address. We'll be very happy to put one in the post to you. And why don't you read what happened and discover the really, really good news of this baby who was born. I've shared a lot of ideas in this talk, and there'll be things that we probably want to just take a bit of time to mull on. And so we thought that the next thing in the order of service shouldn't be a carol that we all join in, but maybe just one that we reflect on and listen to. And it's beautiful carol, and it is taken actually from the next scene in Isaiah's prophecy about this baby. And Isaiah gives the image of a stump of a tree that's been cut down and everything looks dead and hopeless. And then from this stump springs up a little tiny shoot. And that shoot grows up to be the king who is the hope of those in a cold, cold winter. It's been sung by well, I would say it's a 5-part carol. It's been sung by 5 singers, but it's actually 2 singers pretending to be 5 singers. So it's actually Adrian, and Naomi. So I hope you'll enjoy it. And as we reflect on the words, and we'll share some of the joy of this baby who was to be born.